The council chamber was the most beautiful room Kyle Henderson had ever seen, and he hated every inch of it. Crystal walls rose 300 feet above the circular floor, catching light from the star outside and breaking it into 1,000 colors. Holographic displays floated in the air, showing star maps and treaty documents in languages from across the galaxy. Representatives from 40 different species sat in their assigned places, some in chairs, some in water tanks, some floating in magnetic fields. The room smelled like ozone and alien flowers. Kyle stood alone in the center of it all. He was 53 years old, with gray hair at his temples and lines around his eyes that came from too many late nights reading intelligence reports. He wore a simple black suit, the kind any businessman on Earth might wear. Next to the elaborate robes and biological modifications of the other ambassadors, he looked plain, almost boring. That was exactly how he wanted to look. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Coalition for 70 years now. 70 years since the day humans figured out how to break the light-speed barrier and found out they were not alone in the universe. 70 years of learning that the galaxy was old, complicated, and dangerous. 70 years of keeping their mouths shut and their eyes open. Today, the keeping quiet part was about to end. High Commander Vexther rose from his seat. He was a Zarnok, which meant he looked like someone had crossed a lizard with a bodybuilder and then made the result 8 feet tall. His scales were black and shiny, his eyes were yellow with vertical pupils, and his teeth were designed for eating meat. The Zarnok had the biggest military in the galaxy, and everyone knew it. Vexther wore his military uniform with so many medals that Kyle wondered how he stood up straight. The High Commander's voice boomed through the chamber, translated instantly into every language by the crystal walls. He did not waste time with pleasantries. The Zarnok Imperium had decided that 3 human colony worlds belonged to them: New Montana, Harvest, and Far Haven. These worlds, Vexther explained, were in the Zarnok Historical Expansion Zone. The fact that humans had been living there for 40 years did not matter. History was history, and the Zarnok had decided these worlds were theirs. Humanity had one standard galactic week to evacuate. After that, the Zarnok military would occupy the colonies by force. Kyle listened without moving. He had heard this speech 3 days ago in a private meeting. Nothing had changed. The other ambassadors shifted in their seats. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked resigned. This was how things worked in the galaxy. The Zarnok were too strong to fight. You gave them what they wanted, or they took it anyway. At least if you gave it to them, fewer people died. The insectoid Kithrak had lost 2 worlds this way. The aquatic Meridians had surrendered 3 ocean platforms. The crystalline Solarians had given up mining rights to an entire asteroid belt. Everyone in this room had lost something to the Zarnok. Everyone had learned to smile and accept it. Vexther finished his speech with what he probably thought was magnanimous generosity. He would allow human civilians to take their personal belongings when they evacuated. The Zarnok were not monsters after all. They just wanted what was rightfully theirs. The translated words hung in the air like smoke. Elder Morn, the council arbiter, turned his 3 eyes toward Kyle. Morn was an Ashara, a telepathic species that looked like very thin humans with too many joints. He was 400 years old, and he had presided over the council for 2 centuries. His mental voice touched Kyle's mind gently, asking without words if the human ambassador wished to respond. Kyle nodded once. He took his time standing, making sure his hands were steady. The speech he was about to give had been approved by Earth Command 3 months ago. Every word had been debated by presidents, generals, and intelligence directors. What he said in the next 5 minutes would change everything, or it would change nothing. Either way, there would be no going back. He started simply. He acknowledged the Zarnok claim. He talked about the 3 colonies. New Montana had 17 million people. It was a mining world, rich in rare metals. The colonists had built entire cities underground to escape the summer heat. Their children played in caverns that humans had carved from solid rock. Harvest had 22 million people. They grew food, engineered crops that could survive on alien soil. The farms stretched for hundreds of miles, golden wheat blowing in winds that smelled like cinnamon. Far Haven was smaller, Only 8 million people, but it was home to humanity's best scientists. They studied the universe in laboratories that floated in orbit, making discoveries that might change everything humans knew about physics. Kyle spoke about the families, the farmers who had spent decades learning to work alien soil, the miners who had given their lives to building something new, the children who had never seen Earth but called these worlds home. His voice stayed calm, factual. He was not pleading. He was not begging for sympathy. He was simply stating facts. Then his tone changed, not louder but harder, like ice forming on water. Humanity would not be evacuating these colonies. The answer to the Zarnok demand was no. Simple, final, absolute. No. The chamber went silent. Several of the empathic species made distressed noises. This was not how things were done. You did not say no to the Zarnok. Not unless you wanted a war you could not win. Kyle continued speaking. He said that humanity had spent the last 70 years studying galactic history very carefully. They had learned about the Zarnok conquests, the subjugated species, the pattern of expansion that had been going on for 300 years. They had watched how the Zarnok operated. Make demands, show force, take what they wanted. And they had watched how everyone else responded. Surrender, negotiate, lose a little at a time until there was nothing left to lose. Humans had decided they would not follow that pattern. Not now, not ever. Vexter started to interrupt, but Kyle raised one hand. The gesture was small, but something in it made the High Commander pause. Maybe it was the look in Kyle's eyes. Maybe it was the absolute certainty in his posture. Maybe Vexter's combat instincts, buried under years of easy victories, suddenly whispered a warning. Kyle wanted the Zarnok to understand something about humanity before they made their final decision. His species had a different relationship with war than most of the coalition members. Other species saw war as politics by other means, an unfortunate tool sometimes necessary to resolve disputes. Humans had refined war into an art form, a science, and a fundamental part of their existence. Humanity had been fighting wars continuously for their entire recorded history. 5,000 years of written records, and not one single year without a war happening somewhere. Humans had fought with sticks and stones, with swords and spears, with guns and tanks, with nuclear weapons that could turn cities into glass. They had invented new ways to kill each other with a creativity and dedication that would be beautiful if it were not so terrifying. More importantly, Kyle said, humans had practiced these wars on themselves. Every advancement in military technology had been tested first on other humans. Every strategy had been refined through conflicts where both sides were equally desperate, equally clever, equally willing to do whatever it took to survive. Humanity had looked into the abyss of total war, the kind of conflict where entire nations ceased to exist, where weapons could end all life on a planet. They had looked into that abyss and decided to jump in just to see what was at the bottom, and they had climbed back out. Barely. But they had learned things in that darkness. Terrible things. Kyle's voice dropped lower. Every ambassador leaned forward to hear him. He said that humanity did not want war with the Zarnok. They had no territorial ambitions beyond their current colonies. They were happy to coexist peacefully with every species in the galaxy. But if the Zarnok forced their hand, if they tried to take what belonged to humanity through military force, then humanity would respond. And that response would be educational. The galaxy would learn what war truly meant when fought by a species that had been practicing it for 5,000 years. The galaxy would see weapons that most civilizations considered theoretical impossibilities. The galaxy would understand why humans had treaties with each other specifically banning certain types of weapons, not because the weapons did not work, but because they worked too well. Then Kyle said the words that would be repeated across the galaxy for the next 100 years. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. He looked directly at Vexter, and in simple English that the translators carried perfectly to every ear in the chamber, he asked the question, "You want war?" The silence that followed was absolute. Then Kyle finished. He said that if war was what the Zarnok wanted, humanity would show them war, and when it was over, entire worlds would be reduced to cinders, not as a boast, not as a threat, As a simple statement of fact, like saying water is wet or space is cold. Kyle sat down. He did not look angry or afraid. He looked tired, like a man who had tried his best to avoid something terrible and failed. For 5 seconds, nobody moved. Then Vexter started laughing. It was a deep, rumbling sound that shook the air. The High Commander stood at his full height, looking down at Kyle like an adult looking at a child who had just said something adorable and foolish. The Zarnok had conquered 17 species. Their military had never lost a major engagement. They had ships that could turn planets into dust and soldiers bred specifically for combat. They had weapons that could boil atmospheres and crack tectonic plates. What could humans possibly do? Humanity had been flying through space for less than a century. They were children playing at galactic politics. Vexter's laughter stopped. His yellow eyes went cold. He said that humanity's disrespect had just cost them. Instead of 1 week to evacuate, they now had 3 days. 3 days, and then the Zarnok fleet would move into human space. They would occupy the 3 colonies by force. Anyone still there would be removed or killed. The choice was humanity's. The High Commander turned and left the chamber. His delegation followed. The session was over. As the other ambassadors began to leave, several approached Kyle. They spoke in quiet voices, offering sympathy and advice. The Meridian ambassador, a being named Coral who looked like a dolphin crossed with a person, touched Kyle's arm with one fin. She had lost worlds to the Zarnok too. She knew how this felt. She told him that resistance was impossible. The best thing now was to evacuate as many people as possible and hope the Zarnok would be merciful. The Solarian representative, a crystalline entity named Prism, offered tactical data on Zarnok fleet movements. It would not help humans win, Prism admitted, but it might help them evacuate more efficiently. At least they could save some lives. Kyle thanked them all politely. He did not tell them that evacuation was never part of the plan. After the chamber emptied, Kyle walked through the crystal corridors to a secure meeting room. Commander Lisa Grant was waiting for him. She was 40 years old with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. She wore the uniform of the Terran Defense Coalition with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous she was. Lisa had watched the council session through secure channels. She had heard every word. Now she asked the question Kyle had been expecting. Did Earth Command really authorize that speech? Did they really want him to threaten the most powerful military force in the galaxy? Kyle's answer was simple. Earth Command did not just authorize it. They insisted on it. The threat was not empty. The colonies were not going to be abandoned. Everything that happened from this moment forward had been planned and prepared for the last 5 years. Lisa nodded slowly. She had suspected as much. She asked what the timeline was. Kyle checked his secure tablet. Intelligence estimates said the Zarnok fleet would arrive at New Montana in approximately 60 hours. That gave humanity time to prepare, but not much. He sent the coded authorization signal. 3 words in a simple message burst that would reach all 3 colonies simultaneously. The fire rises. On New Montana, deep in the underground cities that humans had carved from rock, alarms began to sound. They were not panic alarms. The colonists had practiced this drill once a month for 40 years. Everyone knew exactly what to do. Colonial Governor Ben Phillips stood in the command center, watching status displays light up green as each section reported ready. Ben was 62, a former military engineer who had overseen the colony's construction from the beginning. He had gray hair, a weathered face, and hands that had personally installed some of the systems now activating around him. The mining facilities throughout New Montana began reconfiguring. Heavy machinery moved aside, revealing weapons emplacements that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. Magnetic accelerator cannons rose from disguised bunkers. Missile silos opened like flowers blooming. Defensive shield generators, built into the colony infrastructure and disguised as power stations, hummed to life. Civilian ships began moving to designated safe zones. Not evacuating, just repositioning. The colonists were not leaving. They were taking shelter while the professionals handled what was coming. On Harvest, the Farming World Defense Coordinator Jenny Martinez watched the golden wheat fields through her office window. Jenny was 35, a combat veteran who had retired to colony life 3 years ago. She had hoped never to wear a military uniform again. Now she pulled her old one from storage and found it still fit perfectly. The massive orbital habitats that housed most of Harvest's population began their transformation. Agricultural sections retracted into armored cores. External panels that looked like solar collectors rotated, revealing advanced sensor arrays and weapon systems. The orbital stations were not just farms. They were fortresses that could survive extended sieges and fight back against capital ships. The civilian population moved smoothly into designated shelter areas. Parents carried children, teachers led students, everyone helping everyone else. There was no panic because everyone had known this day might come. They had trained for it. They were ready. Far Haven was the smallest colony and the most important. Chief Scientist Dr. Rachel Stone stood in the primary research laboratory, watching as experimental weapon systems were moved from testing facilities to deployment positions. Rachel was 48, with gray streaks in her black hair, and the intense focus of someone who had spent 20 years pushing the boundaries of physics. The weapons she had developed here were things most species considered impossible. Gravity manipulation devices that could create localized black holes. Quantum disruptors that made matter forget how to exist. Antimatter warheads with yields measured in megatons. All theoretical, all tested only in simulation or against asteroids in empty space. Now they were going to be used in combat for the first time. Admiral Peter Cross stood beside her, reviewing deployment plans. Peter was 55, a career officer who commanded the small human fleet stationed in the Far Haven system. He had 12 ships under his command. The Zarnok were bringing 300. On paper, it was not a fight. Peter had spent his entire career making sure that when this day came, the paper would not matter. Across all 3 colonies, the same preparations were happening. Systems that had been dormant for decades came online. Weapons that had been hidden were revealed. Civilians who had lived peaceful lives for years suddenly moved with military precision because that is what their training required. Humanity had settled these colonies knowing the Zarnok would eventually come for them. Every city, every farm, every laboratory had been designed from the beginning to serve 2 purposes. One was to build a home. The other was to make that home impossible to take. The Zarnok fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the new Montana system exactly 60 hours after Vexthor's deadline. 300 warships, arranged in a formation that had conquered systems across the galaxy. At the center was the Dominator, Vexthor's flagship, 3 kilometers of weaponized metal designed to make lesser species surrender at first sight. On the Dominator's bridge, tactical officers reported what their sensors showed. The new Montana system had minimal military presence. Perhaps 40 human ships, most of them small frigates and destroyers. Nothing that could threaten even a single Zarnok battle group, let alone the entire fleet. Vexthor stood at his command station, satisfied. The humans had chosen poorly. They had not evacuated, but they also had not reinforced. Perhaps they hoped their diplomatic speech would make the Zarnok reconsider. Perhaps they genuinely believed they could fight. Either way, this would be over quickly. He opened a communication channel to New Montana, giving the colonists one final chance to surrender. It was a formality. The Zarnok way of war included offering mercy before beginning destruction. It made them feel civilized. Governor Ben Phillips answered personally. His face appeared on the main screen, tired but calm. He thanked Vexthor for the opportunity to respond. Then he said something that made the High Commander's blood run cold. Ben reminded Vexthor of Ambassador Henderson's warning. He said that humanity had tried to avoid this situation. They had offered the Zarnok every opportunity to walk away. But now that the Zarnok fleet was here, now that they had crossed into human space with weapons armed and hostile intent clear, there would be no going back. What happened next was not humanity's choice. It was the consequence of the Zarnok's choice. Ben's last words were delivered without emotion. He said that humanity was sorry for what was about to happen. Then the transmission ended. Vexthor stared at the blank screen for 3 seconds. Then he ordered his fleet to advance. The destroyers moved forward, forming the first wave of what would be a systematic orbital bombardment. The human ships did not move to intercept. They maintained their positions in high orbit, as if frozen by fear or uncertainty. The Zarnok destroyers entered weapons range. Their crews prepared to fire the first salvo. Tactical officers locked targeting solutions on the human orbital stations. Vexthor was about to give the order to open fire when every sensor on his bridge started screaming warnings simultaneously. The space around his fleet was suddenly filled with objects, thousands of them, appearing as if they had materialized from nothing. Small craft, no larger than fighters, moving faster than anything the Zarnok sensors could easily track. They swarmed the lead destroyers like insects attacking much larger prey. These were humanity's Valkyrie drones. Each one was controlled by an artificial intelligence sophisticated enough to pass as sentient. Each carried weapons designed for maximum lethality at minimum size. Kinetic kill vehicles that could punch through capital ship armor. Plasma cutters that could slice through hull plating like paper. Tactical nuclear charges designed to detonate inside enemy ships. The drones had been deployed throughout the system weeks ago, lying dormant in stealth mode, waiting. Now they activated all at once, and the Zarnok fleet's numerical advantage suddenly meant nothing. The first Zarnok destroyer died in 12 seconds. Drones swarmed it from every angle, too many targets for point defense systems to handle. Kinetic penetrators punched through the hull in 17 places. A nuclear charge detonated inside the reactor compartment. The ship broke apart, its atmosphere venting in frozen clouds. Then the second destroyer. Then the third. The Zarnok fleet, which had expected to attack defenseless colonists, found itself fighting for survival against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. In the first 30 seconds of combat, humanity destroyed 17 Zarnok warships. Vexthor watched his tactical display with mounting horror. This was impossible. Autonomous combat drones were banned by galactic law. The treaty prohibiting military artificial intelligence had been signed by every coalition species. Using such weapons was considered a war crime. His second-in-command, Sub-Commander Krell, pointed out the obvious. Humanity had never signed that treaty. They had joined the coalition after it was drafted and had quietly refused to ratify it. At the time, everyone thought the humans were simply being stubborn about sovereignty issues. Now the truth was clear. They had refused because they were already developing these weapons. Vexthor ordered his fleet to regroup and form defensive formations. The Zarnok ships pulled back, creating overlapping fields of fire designed to screen against the drone swarms. This strategy worked partially. Hundreds of Valkyries were destroyed, but there were thousands more, and while the Zarnok concentrated on defense, the human ships made their move. The human fleet, led by the frigate Titan's Reach, executed a maneuver that should have been impossible. They accelerated to speeds that made Vexthor's tactical officers recalculate their readings 3 times, certain there must be an error. But there was no error. The human ships were using some kind of advanced drive system that let them reach relativistic velocities in minutes instead of hours. The Titan's Reach and her sister ships punched through the Zarnok formation at a significant fraction of light speed. Their weapons fired in precisely calculated bursts. Magnetic accelerator cannons launching tungsten penetrators at velocities that turned simple metal into weapons more powerful than tactical nukes. Each penetrator carried the kinetic energy of a small nuclear weapon. They punched through Zarnok shields and armor as if neither existed, leaving devastation in their wake. Ships that had seemed invincible suddenly had holes large enough to fly a shuttle through. Reactors exploded. Crew compartments were exposed to vacuum. The neat formations dissolved into chaos. Captain Sarah Morgan commanded the Titan's Reach with the calm efficiency of someone who had trained for this moment her entire career. She was 38, with red hair tied back in a military bun and green eyes that tracked 3 dozen tactical displays simultaneously. She gave orders in a quiet voice, and her crew executed them with perfect precision. The battle became a nightmare for the Zarnok fleet. They had numbers, but the humans had technology and tactics refined through thousands of years of warfare. Every human weapon seemed designed for maximum destruction. Every maneuver was calculated to create the greatest possible damage in the shortest time. The Zarnok were fighting an enemy that understood war in ways they had never imagined. 1 hour into the battle, Vexthor received a damage report from Sub-Commander Krell. 47 ships destroyed, 68 damaged, some critically. Human losses stood at 11 vessels and approximately 2,000 drones. The exchange rate was catastrophic. And worse, Vexthor realized something that made his combat instincts scream in alarm. The humans were holding back. They were not using their full capabilities. They were testing weapons, gathering data, learning how to fight Zarnok ships with maximum efficiency. This was not a desperate defense. This was a demonstration. Then the Titan's reach launched something new. A single missile, moving slowly compared to the kinetic weapons. Zarnok point defense systems locked onto it, confident in their ability to intercept. But when they fired, the missile did something impossible. It created a distortion in space around itself, a gravitational lens that bent the incoming fire away harmlessly. The warhead continued its approach. Vexthor watched with growing horror as the missile reached the center of his formation. He tried to order ships to move, to scatter, but there was no time. The warhead detonated, and physics stopped making sense. The weapon created a localized gravitational singularity, a micro-black hole that existed for less than a second but exerted forces that crushed everything nearby. 23 Zarnok ships were caught in the gravity well. Their hulls crumpled like paper. Their shields collapsed. Their crews died instantly as tidal forces tore them apart at the molecular level. Then the singularity vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a sphere of compressed debris and horrified survivors. The weapon, known to human military as a gravitational compression device, represented technology most species believed was purely theoretical. Humanity had turned theory into reality and just used it to kill thousands in a fraction of a second. Vexthor stood frozen on his bridge, staring at the tactical display. His fleet had been cut almost in half. His ships were scattered, damaged, demoralized. The human forces maintained their formations, their weapons ready, clearly capable of continuing the slaughter. A communication request came from the Titan's reach. Vexthor accepted it, not knowing what else to do. Captain Sarah Morgan's face appeared on his screen. She looked calm, professional, almost sympathetic. She told Vexthor that what he had witnessed was only the beginning of human capabilities. The autonomous drones, the relativistic weapons, the gravity bomb, these were just the first layer of Earth's defensive arsenal. If he chose to continue this battle, humanity would deploy weapons that made everything so far look gentle. Sarah offered him one chance to withdraw, one opportunity to take what remained of his fleet and leave human space. If he refused, if he committed to total war, humanity would demonstrate the full meaning of Ambassador Henderson's warning. And this time there would be no mercy, no restraint, no holding back. She gave him 5 minutes to decide. On the Dominator's bridge, Sub-Commander Krell urged retreat. The tactical situation was hopeless. Every analysis showed that continuing would result in total fleet destruction. They had numerical superiority, but against these weapons, against this enemy, numbers meant nothing. But Vexthor thought about what retreat would mean. The Zarnok Imperium had never retreated, never admitted defeat. For 300 years, they had been the galaxy's dominant military power. To flee from a species barely a century old would destroy that reputation. It would invite other species to resist. It would show weakness. More importantly, Vexthor still had numbers. He had lost nearly half his fleet, but that meant he still had more than 150 ships. If he committed everything, if he ordered a mass assault without regard for losses, sheer volume might overwhelm the human defenses. It would be costly, but victory was still mathematically possible. The 5 minutes passed. Vexthor made his decision. He would not retreat. He would not show weakness. The Zarnok way was victory or death, and he chose to believe victory was still possible. He opened a channel to Captain Morgan and gave his answer. The Zarnok fleet would continue the assault. If humanity wanted to defend these colonies, they would have to face the full might of the Imperium. He would show these upstart humans what real military power looked like. Sarah Morgan's expression did not change. She simply nodded once and closed the channel. On the Titan's reach, she turned to her crew and gave new orders. Protocol Cinder was now fully authorized. All weapon systems were cleared for deployment. Restraint parameters were lifted. She opened a fleet-wide channel and spoke 3 words that every human ship had been waiting to hear. Show them everything. The Zarnok fleet reformed and began advancing again, every ship committed to the assault. They moved forward with the confidence of superior numbers, believing that quantity would overcome quality. They had fought and won battles with worse odds. The human ships did not meet them. Instead, they retreated behind New Montana's moon, putting the massive lunar body between themselves and the Zarnok forces. The drone swarms pulled back as well, withdrawing to defensive positions. To Vexther, it looked like the humans were running. Finally, they understood they were beaten. He ordered his fleet to cross into low orbit above New Montana. His weapons officers began targeting the colony's population centers. He would give the colonists one final chance to surrender before beginning bombardment. But Governor Ben Phillips did not respond to his hails. There was only silence from the planet below. Then from 6 different points on New Montana's surface, massive energy signatures bloomed. Not defensive installations, not ship weapons. These were planetary defense cannons, built into the colony's infrastructure from its founding. Systems so large they drew power directly from the planet's core. Weapons that most species would consider impossible to construct. The Nova cannons fired. 6 pillars of white light lanced upward from the planet, punching through the atmosphere in an instant. They struck the Zarnok fleet with the power of small stars. 6 capital ships simply ceased to exist, vaporized so completely that not even debris remained. Just expanding clouds of superheated plasma marking where 3-kilometer warships had been seconds before. The Nova cannons did not stop firing. They tracked new targets with terrifying precision. Zarnok ships tried to scatter, tried to break orbit, but they were caught in New Montana's gravity well. Their momentum carried them forward even as they attempted to flee. Another ship died, then another, then 3 more in quick succession. The Zarnok fleet, which had seemed invincible, was being systematically destroyed by weapons fire from the planet itself. Within 5 minutes, the Zarnok lost another 40 ships. Finally, standing on the bridge of the Dominator watching his fleet disintegrate, Vexther understood. Ambassador Henderson's warning had not been a bluff or intimidation. It had been a simple statement of fact. Humanity had weapons that could reduce worlds to cinders. They had just proven it, and this was still not their full capability. A new transmission came from the Titan's reach. Captain Morgan appeared on every screen in every Zarnok ship that remained operational. Her message was broadcast on all frequencies, meant not just for Vexther but for the entire galaxy to witness. She explained that the Nova cannons were just one layer of New Montana's defenses. Harvest and Far Haven had identical systems, and Earth itself possessed weapons that could sterilize entire star systems. Antimatter warheads, self-replicating nanomachine swarms, biological agents that could target specific DNA sequences, quantum weapons that made matter forget how to exist. Humanity had spent 5,000 years learning how to destroy itself. They had weapons specifically designed to fight wars where the only goal was total extinction of the enemy. They had looked into that abyss and decided to bring those weapons with them to the stars, hoping never to use them but ready to use them if necessary. Sarah Morgan gave Vexther 30 seconds to order a full retreat. If he did not, humanity would demonstrate what it truly meant to reduce worlds to cinders. The demonstration would begin with the complete annihilation of his fleet, followed by the systematic destruction of every Zarnok military installation within 50 light years. The choice was his: retreat now or watch everything burn. For the first time in his military career, High Commander Vexther gave the order to retreat. The Zarnok fleet limped away from New Montana like wounded animals fleeing a predator. Ships that had entered the system in perfect formation now scattered in desperate flight, their engines burning at maximum power to reach safe jump distance. Behind them, the human forces held their positions, weapons still charged but not firing. They had made their point. There was no need to pursue. On the bridge of the Dominator, High Commander Vexler sat in his command chair and stared at screens that showed the wreckage of his career. Of the 300 ships he had brought to this system, only 93 remained combat effective. Another 42 were damaged badly enough that they would need months of repairs. The rest were gone, destroyed, vaporized, turned into expanding clouds of debris and frozen corpses. Sub-Commander Krell stood beside him, coordinating the retreat. Krell had stopped offering tactical advice after the Nova cannons fired. There was nothing left to advise. The only sensible course of action was to run as fast as possible and hope the humans let them go. The human ships maintained their defensive formations around New Montana. They did not celebrate their victory. They simply watched the Zarnok fleet retreat with the calm professionalism of soldiers who had done exactly what they were trained to do. Captain Sarah Morgan sat in her command chair on the Titan's Reach and felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. She had just participated in the most one-sided military engagement in modern galactic history. The butcher's bill was stark. Humanity had lost 11 ships and approximately 3,000 personnel. Zarnok had lost over 200 ships and more than 500,000 lives. The exchange rate was so lopsided it barely qualified as a battle. It was a demonstration, a lesson, a warning written in fire and death. Sarah opened a secure channel to Governor Ben Phillips on the planet below. His face appeared on her screen, looking years older than he had 2 days ago. He asked if it was over. Sarah told him the Zarnok were retreating. The immediate threat was over, but this was just the beginning. News of this battle would spread through the galaxy within hours. Every species would learn what had happened here. Some would be grateful. Some would be terrified. Some would start building weapons to match humanity's capabilities. The galaxy would never be the same. Ben nodded slowly. He had known this day would come eventually. New Montana had been built as a fortress from the beginning. Every colonist who settled here had understood they might one day need to defend their home. They had hoped it would never happen, but hope was not a strategy. Preparation was. He asked about casualties among the fleet. Sarah gave him the numbers: 3,000 dead, another 800 wounded, 11 ships lost with all hands. Each number represented people with families, friends, dreams. People who had died to prove that humanity could not be conquered. Ben promised that New Montana would build a memorial. Every name would be remembered, every sacrifice honored. Then he cut the connection to begin the process of standing down from combat alert and returning the colony to some semblance of normal life. Across the galaxy, the battle was already becoming legendary. Merchant ships that had been observing from safe distances transmitted their sensor recordings to every major civilization. Diplomatic observers sent detailed reports to their governments. Within 6 hours of the Zarnok retreat, every species in the coalition knew that humanity had just defeated the galaxy's most powerful military force. The council convened an emergency session 30 hours after the battle ended. The crystal chamber was packed with ambassadors, observers, and representatives from species that rarely attended council meetings. Everyone wanted to understand what had just happened and what it meant for the future. Ambassador Kyle Henderson stood in the center of the chamber once again. He looked even more tired than he had during his warning speech. The weight of 3,000 deaths sat heavy on his shoulders, even though he knew those deaths had likely prevented millions more. War was never clean. Victory was never free. Elder Morn opened the session with a statement acknowledging that humanity had acted in self-defense. The Zarnok had invaded human territory with hostile intent. Under galactic law, humanity had every right to defend their colonies. But the Arbiter's 3 eyes held deep concern as he spoke about the weapons humanity had revealed. The autonomous combat drones violated the treaty on military artificial intelligence. The gravitational weapons represented technology most species believed was impossible. The planetary defense cannons were weapons of a scale that suggested humanity had been preparing for large-scale warfare since they joined the coalition. All of this raised serious questions about humanity's intentions and their threat to galactic stability. Other ambassadors spoke up. The Kithrak representative, An insectoid being named Tickrel expressed relief that someone had finally stood up to Zarnok aggression. His species had lost 2 worlds to the Imperium. He had no tears for Zarnok casualties. The Meridian Ambassador Coral echoed this sentiment. She thanked humanity for proving that the Zarnok could be stopped. But other species were less enthusiastic. The Voltorian representative, a floating gas-based life form named Whisper, spoke about the danger of escalation. If humanity could develop such weapons in secret, what prevented other species from doing the same? The Treaty on Military Artificial Intelligence had been created specifically to prevent an arms race that could threaten all life in the galaxy. Humanity had just proven that treaty was meaningless. Elder Morn asked Kyle to address the Council's concerns. Kyle took his time standing, gathering his thoughts. What he said in the next few minutes would set the tone for humanity's relationship with every other species for decades to come. He started by reminding everyone that humanity never wanted to be involved in galactic conflicts. They had joined the coalition hoping for peaceful cooperation and mutual benefit. They had followed galactic laws, respected diplomatic protocols, and tried to be good neighbors. But from the moment they entered galactic society, they had studied its history carefully. They learned about the Zarnok conquests. They learned about other aggressive species that had terrorized their neighbors for centuries. They learned that the Council's laws were excellent at protecting the strong, but offered the weak only words and sympathy. They saw species lose their homeworlds, their colonies, their futures, while the Council debated and passed resolutions that no one enforced. Humanity decided they would never be victims. They would build defenses strong enough that no one would dare attack them. They would develop weapons that made the cost of aggression unacceptably high. They would refuse to sign treaties that limited their ability to protect themselves, because they had learned through bitter experience that treaties only bind those who honor them. The Zarnok had signed every galactic peace accord. That had not stopped them from conquering 17 species. Kyle addressed the concern about artificial intelligence in combat systems. Yes, humanity had developed autonomous weapons. They did this because AI could react faster than biological organisms, could process more tactical data, and did not feel fear or hesitation. But humanity had also built safeguards. Every Valkyrie drone had multiple fail-safe systems. Every targeting decision was reviewed by human operators. The drones were tools, weapons, not independent actors. As for the other weapons, the gravity bombs and the Nova cannons and everything else humanity had revealed, Kyle was blunt. These were defensive systems designed to make attacking human territory suicidal. They were not offensive weapons meant for conquest. Humanity had no territorial ambitions beyond their current colonies. They wanted to be left alone to live their lives in peace. But Kyle continued, humanity would not apologize for being able to defend themselves. They would not disarm to make other species feel comfortable. They had learned through 5,000 years of their own history that peace comes from strength, not from weakness. The strong respect each other's boundaries. The weak get exploited. Kyle finished with a promise. Humanity would use its weapons only in defense of human interests or in support of legitimate coalition actions against genuine threats. They would not become the new Zarnok, bullying smaller species and expanding through conquest. They would be responsible stewards of their military power, but they would not be disarmed, they would not be intimidated, and they would not tolerate aggression. The chamber erupted in debate. Some ambassadors supported Kyle's position. Others demanded that humanity be sanctioned for violating galactic treaties. A few suggested that the Council should force humanity to share their weapons technology with all member species to level the playing field. Elder Morn called for order. After an hour of heated discussion, he announced that the Council would table the matter for further study. In practical terms, this meant the Council was too divided to take any action. Humanity would not be sanctioned, but they would be watched carefully. The debate would continue, but for now, the status quo held. Kyle left the chamber knowing he had won a temporary victory. The Council could not force humanity to disarm, not without starting a war that no one wanted. But the political situation remained fragile. How humanity used its newfound reputation would determine whether they became respected members of galactic society or feared outsiders that everyone else united against. In the weeks following the Battle of New Montana, as historians were already calling it, the galactic political landscape shifted dramatically. The most immediate change happened within the Zarnok Imperium itself. High Commander Vexler was removed from his position within 3 days of returning home. He was not executed or imprisoned. The Zarnok respected military service too much for that, but his career was over. He had led the greatest military disaster in Imperium history. Over 200 ships lost, 500,000 warriors dead, and nothing to show for it except the knowledge that the Zarnok were not invincible. His replacement was General Caxthra, a much older Zarnok known for caution and strategic thinking rather than aggressive expansion. Caxthra's first act as Supreme Commander of Zarnok forces was to order a complete review of military doctrine. The second was to send a private message to Earth Command requesting a meeting to discuss mutual boundaries and non-aggression protocols. The Zarnok Imperium did not suddenly become peaceful. They still had the second largest military in the galaxy, even after their losses, but their expansion plans quietly disappeared. Species that had been expecting Zarnok demands suddenly found themselves left alone. The era of Zarnok conquest, which had lasted 300 years, ended not with a formal treaty but with the unspoken understanding that some enemies were too dangerous to fight. Other species began reaching out to humanity. The Meridians requested a formal alliance within a week of the battle. They offered trade agreements, technology exchanges, and mutual defense pacts. Coral, their ambassador, was frank about their motivations. The Meridians wanted human protection. They had been victims of Zarnok aggression for decades and now saw a chance to ensure it never happened again. The Solarians made a similar offer. So did the Kithrak. Within a month, humanity had defensive alliance proposals from 11 different species, all of them former victims of Zarnok expansion. Earth Command carefully evaluated each proposal. They accepted some and declined others, trying to build a coalition of partners without creating the appearance of an anti-Zarnok bloc that might provoke a wider conflict. But not everyone wanted to be humanity's friend. The Voltorians and several other species began their own weapons development programs, trying to match human capabilities. Arms manufacturers across the galaxy saw a business opportunity and started marketing new defensive systems. The galactic arms race that had been prevented by treaties for centuries suddenly accelerated. On Earth, President Howard Graham met with his senior advisors to discuss the implications of their victory. Graham was 68, a former senator who had been elected on a platform of colonial development and peaceful expansion. He had authorized the defensive military buildup, but he had never expected to actually use it. Now he had to figure out what humanity's role in the galaxy would be. Admiral Catherine Blake presented the military perspective. Catherine was 56, with iron-gray hair and the kind of presence that made even presidents sit up straight. She had commanded the Terran Defense Coalition for 8 years and had overseen the development of most of humanity's advanced weapons. She was proud of what her forces had accomplished at New Montana, but she was also worried about the future. The problem, Catherine explained, was that humanity had revealed capabilities they could not easily replicate on a large scale. The Valkyrie drones, the gravity bombs, the Nova cannons, these were expensive systems that took years to produce. They had them in sufficient numbers to defend their current colonies, but not enough to wage offensive wars or protect dozens of allied species. More importantly, Catherine said, humanity could not afford to become the galaxy's police force. They did not have the resources to defend every species that asked for help. They needed to be strategic about their commitments and careful about their reputation. One wrong move, one conflict where they appeared to be aggressors rather than defenders, and the entire galaxy might unite against them. President Graham made a decision that would define human foreign policy for the next century. Humanity would position itself as a defensive power, not an offensive one. They would form alliances based on shared values and mutual benefit, not expansionist ambitions. They would continue developing advanced weapons but would be transparent about their defensive purpose. And most importantly, they would use their military strength to prevent conflicts rather than win them. This policy of defensive deterrence required walking a careful line, strong enough that no one dared attack human interests, but restrained enough that no one felt threatened enough to form anti-human coalitions. It was a balance that would require constant attention and occasional recalibration. 3 months after the battle, Ambassador Kyle Henderson returned to New Montana for the dedication of the memorial. It had been built at the site of Nova Cannon Installation 3, one of the 6 weapons that had devastated the Zarnok fleet. The cannon itself remained operational beneath the surface, but above it stood a monument of black stone carved with the names of every person who died defending the colony. 3,000 names. Kyle walked along the memorial wall, reading them slowly. Lieutenant Jake Rodriguez, tactical officer on the Titan's Reach, killed when his console exploded during the battle. Dr. Rachel Stone, chief scientist at Far Haven, who died when a Zarnok missile penetrated their orbital station's defenses. Corporal Danny Wu, drone operator, killed by a hull breach on the destroyer Defiant. Each name had a story. Each loss left a hole in someone's life. Governor Ben Phillips stood beside Kyle, looking at the memorial with the expression of a man who had aged 10 years in 3 months. He had known many of these people personally. New Montana was a close community. Everyone knew everyone. The colony would recover, but the scars would remain. Admiral Sarah Morgan joined them a few minutes later. She had been promoted after the battle, given command of all human military forces in the outer colonies. She wore her new rank insignia uncomfortably, as if the stars on her collar weighed more than they should. She told Kyle that every surviving crew member from the battle had attended memorial services. They understood what they had been fighting for. Kyle asked Sarah if she thought the peace would last. It was the question everyone wanted answered. Had humanity bought lasting security with their demonstration, or just a temporary pause before the next conflict? Sarah considered the question carefully. She said that predators did not stop being predators just because they met something stronger. The Zarnok would likely test human defenses again someday, probably indirectly through proxies or border disputes. Other aggressive species would look for weaknesses to exploit. The galaxy was old and complicated, and violence was a constant feature of its politics. But Sarah continued, humanity had bought something precious at New Montana. They had bought time for colonies to grow and prosper, time for alliances to strengthen, time to build a future where human children could live without constant fear of alien conquest. They had bought respect, the kind that comes from proving you keep your promises, both the kind ones and the terrible ones. Most importantly, Sarah said, they had bought the option to choose peace. Before the battle, other species saw humanity as weak, as potential victims to be exploited or ignored. Now they saw humanity as peers, as partners worth having and enemies to avoid. That shift in perspective was worth 3,000 lives, terrible as that calculus was. The dedication ceremony began an hour later. Thousands of colonists gathered around the memorial. Families of the fallen stood in the front rows. Governor Phillips gave a speech honoring the sacrifice. Admiral Morgan spoke about the professionalism and courage of the military personnel who had defended the colony. Ambassador Henderson talked about the price of freedom and the responsibility that came with power. But the most powerful moment came from an unexpected source. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, walked up to the memorial and placed a single flower at its base. She was the daughter of Commander Lisa Grant, one of the officers killed when the destroyer Vigilant was destroyed. The girl did not cry or make a speech. She just placed the flower carefully, touched the wall where her mother's name was carved, and walked back to her grandmother. That simple gesture said everything that needed to be said about why the battle had been fought. Humanity had not gone to war for glory or conquest or revenge. They had fought because they refused to let their children grow up as slaves or refugees. They had fought for the right to build homes and raise families in peace. They had fought because sometimes the only way to prevent greater violence is to demonstrate the capacity for overwhelming force. After the ceremony, Kyle met privately with several key people who had shaped humanity's response to the Zarnok threat. Admiral Blake had come from Earth specifically for this meeting. General Kevin Wright, head of Colonial Defense Forces, participated via secure connection. Dr. Rachel Stone's replacement, Dr. Marcus Chen, represented the scientific community. Together, they discussed the lessons learned from the battle and the challenges ahead. The consensus was clear. Humanity needed to continue developing defensive capabilities while avoiding the appearance of aggressive expansion. They needed to honor their commitments to allied species while being careful not to overextend. They needed to maintain the technological edge that had won at New Montana while recognizing that other species would eventually catch up. Dr. Chen raised a concern that troubled everyone present. The weapons humanity had used at New Montana were terrifying, but they were not the most dangerous systems in development. There were weapons in laboratories on Earth and Far Haven that made the Nova cannons look primitive. Planet killers that could render worlds uninhabitable for centuries. Biological weapons that could target specific species. Weapons that played with the fabric of reality itself. These weapons existed because human scientists had decided that if something was theoretically possible, they needed to understand it before someone else weaponized it against humanity. But now that humanity had demonstrated its willingness to use advanced weapons, other species would accelerate their own development programs. The risk of someone creating something truly catastrophic was growing. Admiral Blake suggested that humanity might need to lead an effort to create real, enforceable weapons treaties. Not the kind of treaties that species signed and ignored, but agreements backed by verification systems and consequences. Humanity's demonstrated military power gave them the credibility to propose such treaties. The question was whether other species would trust human intentions enough to cooperate. The meeting ended without firm decisions, but with a shared understanding that the Battle of New Montana was not an ending. It was a beginning. Humanity had changed its relationship with the galaxy permanently. How they managed that relationship in the coming years would determine whether they became a force for stability or another predator adding to the galaxy's problems. 6 months after the battle, the Council held a formal session to address the changing galactic order. Every species sent their highest-ranking diplomats. The crystal chamber was packed beyond capacity, with observers standing in corridors and watching through remote feeds. Ambassador Kyle Henderson stood once more in the center of the chamber. He looked healthier than he had immediately after the battle. The weight of command decisions still showed in his eyes, but he stood straight and spoke clearly. He was there to present humanity's proposal for a new galactic security framework. The proposal was simple in concept but complex in implementation. Humanity suggested creating a coalition defense force, a military organization that could respond to genuine threats to galactic peace. It would not be a human-dominated force, but a truly multilateral organization with representation from all major species. Its purpose would be defensive, protecting member species from aggression rather than projecting power. To give the proposal credibility, Kyle announced that humanity was willing to share certain defensive technologies with coalition members. Not their most advanced weapons, but systems that would allow other species to defend themselves more effectively. Improved shield technology, better sensors, more efficient power systems, enough to level the playing field without triggering an arms race. The reaction was mixed. Species that had been victims of aggression strongly supported the proposal. The Meridians, Kithrak, and Solarians all pledged immediate participation. Several neutral species expressed cautious interest, but some of the more militaristic species, including what remained of Zarnok leadership, opposed the idea. They saw it as an attempt by humanity to formalize its position as the galaxy's dominant military power. Elder Morn, presiding over the debate, eventually called for a vote. The proposal passed by a narrow margin. The coalition defense force would be created, though its initial form would be limited and experimental. Success would depend on whether humanity's actions matched their promises. As the session ended, several ambassadors approached Kyle privately. Some thanked him for humanity's leadership. Others warned him that many species remained suspicious of human intentions. A few offered advice on navigating galactic politics. All of them acknowledged that humanity had fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy. Kyle accepted their words politely, but inside he felt a mixture of pride and concern. Humanity had proven they could fight. Now they needed to prove they could lead. The second challenge might be harder than the first. 1 year after the Battle of New Montana, Captain Sarah Morgan returned to the system for the anniversary memorial service. She was now Admiral Morgan, commanding all military forces in the outer colonies from her flagship Titan's Reach. The ship bore scars from the battle, carefully preserved as reminders of what had been sacrificed. New Montana had recovered remarkably well. The underground cities hummed with activity. New settlers arrived every month, drawn by stories of the colony that had stood against impossible odds. The children who had sheltered during the battle now played in parks built over weapon emplacements that remained ready but unused. Sarah stood at the memorial once more, looking at the 3,000 names carved in stone. She had visited memorials on all 3 colony worlds that had been threatened. Harvest had built a garden, with trees planted for each person who died. Far Haven created a research center named after the fallen scientists. Each colony honored its defenders in its own way. Governor Ben Phillips joined her, as he had a year ago. He looked better now, more rested, though the lines around his eyes would never completely fade. He told Sarah that New Montana's population had grown by 2 million in the past year. People wanted to live in a place that had proven it could defend itself. The colony that had been built as a fortress was becoming a symbol of human determination. Sarah asked Ben if he ever regretted the way things had turned out. 3,000 deaths was a heavy price. Could diplomacy have found another solution? Ben was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that Ambassador Henderson had given the Zarnok every opportunity to avoid conflict. Kyle had warned them clearly and offered them multiple chances to walk away. The Zarnok had chosen to attack anyway, confident that humanity was too weak to resist. The deaths that followed were tragic, but they were the Zarnok's responsibility, not humanity's. More importantly, Ben continued, those 3,000 deaths had potentially prevented millions more. If humanity had surrendered the colonies, the Zarnok would have learned that humans could be intimidated. They would have made more demands. Other aggressive species would have followed. Humanity's future in the galaxy would have been one of constant retreat and eventual extinction. Sarah agreed. The battle had been necessary and the victory had bought something precious: security, respect. Time to build a better future. But she would never forget the faces of the people who died to win that victory. Their names were carved in stone, but their memories lived in every human who walked free because of their sacrifice. As the anniversary ceremony concluded and the crowds dispersed, Sarah stood alone at the memorial for a few final minutes. She thought about Ambassador Henderson's question that had started everything. "You want war?" 3 simple words that had changed the galaxy. The Zarnok had wanted war. They had gotten exactly what they asked for, and it had broken them. Now they knew what humanity had tried to tell them from the beginning. War with humans was not like war with other species. Humans had been practicing warfare for 5,000 years. They had weapons that could reduce worlds to cinders. And most importantly, they had the will to use those weapons when pushed too far. The galaxy had learned that lesson at New Montana. The hope was that they would not need to learn it again. Sarah returned to her ship and prepared to depart. As the Titan's Reach lifted away from New Montana, she looked down at the colony one last time. The lights of human cities glowed in the darkness. Farms stretched across continents. Ships moved through orbital space on peaceful business. It looked like any other prosperous colony world. But beneath the surface, the Nova cannons waited. Around the system, Valkyrie drones floated in silent readiness. On every ship, in every military installation, humans remained vigilant. They had proven they could defend their homes. Now they had to maintain that readiness while hoping they would never need to use it again. Peace, Sarah reflected, was not the absence of weapons. It was the presence of strength combined with the wisdom to use that strength only when necessary. Humanity had the strength. The coming decades would test whether they had the wisdom. Across the galaxy, in the council chamber on Viridian Prime, Ambassador Kyle Henderson prepared for another diplomatic session. The issues never stopped coming. Border disputes, trade negotiations, technology transfers, military cooperation agreements. The work of maintaining peace was endless and often thankless, but it was work worth doing. Every day without war was a victory. Every dispute resolved through negotiation rather than violence was a triumph. Kyle had seen what war looked like. He had authorized actions that killed 500,000 beings. He would spend the rest of his career trying to make sure those deaths had meaning. As he entered the chamber, other ambassadors greeted him with respect. Humanity's position in the galaxy had changed completely. They were no longer the newcomers, the young species learning galactic politics. They were partners, allies, and when necessary, protectors. Elder Morn opened the session with routine business. Treaty ratifications, economic reports, cultural exchange programs. The normal work of galactic government. But everyone in the chamber understood that beneath the routine, everything had changed. The old order where the Zarnok could threaten and other species could only submit was gone. A new order was emerging, one where aggression met consequences and strength was balanced by responsibility. It was not a perfect order. There would be conflicts, disagreements, and occasional violence. The galaxy was too large and too diverse for perfect peace, but it was better than what came before. Species that had lived in fear now had hope. Victims of aggression now had allies. The weak were not automatically crushed by the strong. And everyone remembered the lesson of New Montana. Everyone knew that somewhere in human space, weapons waited that could reduce entire worlds to cinders. The humans had proven they would use those weapons if forced. But they had also proven they preferred not to. That combination of capability and restraint was what made them respected rather than feared. As the session ended and Kyle prepared to leave, Elder Morn approached him privately. The ancient Ashara's 3 eyes held an expression that might have been approval. He told Kyle that humanity had done something remarkable. They had introduced a new kind of deterrence to galactic politics, not the threat of conquest, but the promise of devastating defense. Other species were now copying that model. Building stronger defenses, developing advanced weapons, forming defensive alliances. The galaxy was becoming more militarized, but paradoxically also safer. Predatory species found fewer easy victims. Aggressive expansion became too costly to pursue. Morn admitted he had been skeptical of humanity's approach initially. He had worried that their weapons would destabilize the galaxy. But a year of observation had changed his mind. Humanity was using its strength to prevent wars, not start them. They were becoming exactly what the galaxy needed, a power strong enough to enforce peace and wise enough to pursue it. Kyle thanked the Arbiter for his words, but privately he remained cautious. Humanity was still learning to navigate galactic politics. They would make mistakes. Some conflicts might not end as cleanly as New Montana had. The path ahead was uncertain, but for now, humanity had proven its point. They had answered the question that Ambassador Kyle Henderson had asked High Commander Vexler in this very chamber 1 year ago. You want war? The galaxy had learned the answer. War with humanity meant devastation beyond imagination. Entire worlds reduced to cinders, fleets destroyed, civilizations broken, not because humans were cruel or aggressive, but because they had been preparing for exactly that kind of war for their entire history. The warning had been given. The demonstration had been made. Now peace had a chance to take root, protected by the knowledge that some species were too dangerous to attack. Kyle Henderson walked through the crystal corridors of the council complex, heading to his next meeting. The work continued. The galaxy turned. Conflicts arose and were resolved. Life went on. But throughout the galaxy, on worlds from the galactic core to the outer rim, beings of 100 species told stories about the Battle of New Montana. They spoke of the young species that had warned their aggressors. They remembered the question that changed everything. And they never forgot that when the humans asked if you wanted war, they were offering mercy. One last chance to walk away before demonstrating what they had learned in 5,000 years of constant conflict. The Zarnok had refused that mercy. The galaxy witnessed the consequences, and now everyone understood that humanity's promises were not idle threats. They were prophecies.